Welcome to another episode of Chicory's Maintenance. This time we're putting the heat exchanger exhaust manifold combination and the water injection elbow together and then putting them on the generator. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is preparing everything for putting on the engine. There's a couple things that need to be done ahead of time, and I just wanted to review those. The first thing you'll notice is that I have an unacceptable gasket surface where the gasket goes together with the stainless steel exhaust water injection elbow. And so there's a couple things that I do to prepare this surface. One of the things I have is a very fine machinist's file, and if I were to file like this, there would be this chance that I'd be rounding over some edges and not having a flat machine surface. So what I do is I lay this on flat, I put my pressure down straight on the center right over the gasket area, and I massage in circles, and while I'm massaging in circles I rotate my hand to make sure that any high spot or any imperfection is removed. So I keep on doing that, and I do that until the surface is clean. I'll get back to you a second and show you what it looks like when it's finished. So you can see probably now that I've cleaned up this gasket surface. It's not perfect, it's not factory, but in between each bolt and the perimeter you can see that there's shiny metal, so it's going to seal very well with this gasket. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing with the gasket surfaces on the back side that go to the exhaust manifold and the thermostat. And I'm just going to put my pressure on the gasket surface, and once again do a little bit of a swirly circle, making sure that I'm not rounding off any corners. And you can see when I do that, that there's some high spots on the edge and there's a little bit of a low spot in here. Now I'm not taking off a lot of metal, very, very small amount. You know, we're talking tens of thousandths of an inch. But it allows me to get the surface nice and clean. Now I'm just going to do this over here. And I can feel the file cutting. I'm just going to finish this up and I'll be back in a second. So I'm back, and I'm hoping that you can see that these gasket surfaces are shiny. I did finish up with a little bit of Scotch-Brite, just doing a little bit of polishing, but I'm happy the way these gasket surfaces look. I do have obviously a new gasket, and it'll fit nicely here, so everything looks good there. I've cleaned up the surfaces inside here. The next step is, because I did some filing and some cleaning, I want to chase all these threads. I want to make sure that when I put these bolts in that I don't have any issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a little bit of my penetrating oil, and I'm going to put it on my tap, and I'm going to chase these threads with the proper size tap. And you can see the tap going all the way through. So I'm just going to finish this up now. So I've chased all these threads with a tap, and I've gone the extra step of actually taking the nut and screwing them in to make sure that I don't have any binding. The reason that's important is I'm relying on the clamping pressure of the nut with the gasket to make this seal. And if there is binding when I put the nut or the bolt into the hole, it's going to give me a false sense of torque that's being put in. So by chasing the threads and being able to hand turn in easily every single bolt, I know that when I put pressure on the hex head, that pressure is being transferred to squeezing the gasket and not just binding the threads. The last thing I did is I have a stud, if you remember, that goes in this lower corner, and I was just checking my clearance, and I do have clearance, but I don't like how far the stud is going in. There must be just a little bit of an edge or a burr there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a countersink, and I'm just going to round off the edge just a little bit. And I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but I just chamfered the edge just the most teeniest amount. Now I'm going to take my stud, screw it in, and that I'm a little happier with. So now I'm going to start my assembly process of putting the water injection elbow, which is now stainless steel as opposed to the cast iron I had before. This should last the life of the generator, hopefully. So I'm going to assemble that now. So I have the water injection elbow attached to the exhaust manifold part of the combination exhaust manifold and expansion tank. I'm very happy with how everything turned out. Now there's 2, 4, 6, 8 bolts that hold this whole assembly to the head. And much like chasing the threads with the tap, you can see that some of the bolts that hold this on have a little bit of corrosion on them, and so I need to clean those up as well. And I use a die for that. So this is the proper size die, a 6mm by 1mm pitch. And so I just start it in the tap using a proper size box end wrench. I'm just turning those threads in through the die. And I think you can see probably on camera that that thread is so much cleaner. I'm a little bit unhappy with some oxidation that's there, so I'm just going to take the Scotch-Brite, clean that up as well. And if this was really bad, I could once again take the file, make sure there's no burrs or nothing standing out there. Do a little bit more with the Scotch-Brite. And now I have a bolt that I'm comfortable putting back in, and that's going to be nice and clean. So now I'm going to do that with the rest of these, including checking out the nuts and cleaning up the washers. And I'll be back in a second. So I've cleaned up all the bolts and the nuts. I've chased all the threads. The last step before I start assembly is the heat exchanger itself. I think I told you in the last video that I soaked this in vinegar. It's cleaned out everything very well. I chased every hole through with a long bamboo skewer. I'm very happy with how clean this is, except I've got on the end here, if you remember, the rubber boot seals to the heat exchanger and also seals to the expansion tank. So just to make sure that this surface is exactly as clean as it can be, I'm taking just a little bit of Scotch-Brite and I'm just putting light pressure on it and just cleaning up any possible crud that can get in the way of getting a very good seal. Now I can look at the surface and it's nice and smooth, and I don't have any inclusions that might interfere with the gasket seal. And once again, you can see this end again. There's like some hard water deposits, or it might be some coolant or something. So all I'm doing is just polishing that away, making sure that I'm going to have a really nice surface. Just going to take a paper towel, clean it up a little bit, and you can see now that both ends are nice and clean. Now I certainly could do the center here if I wanted, just to polish this a little bit. That would strictly just be aesthetics. But just do that a little bit just to make sure that there's no debris on there. So now that's ready to go in. You can see that I have the engine apart now. That includes the starboard enclosure and the sound enclosure. I have everything off, not necessarily because I need it to access for this change that I'm doing with the expansion tank combination exhaust manifold, but I am going to finish the installation of all of the other components as part of my previous project, was changing the vibration isolation mounts. So I have to do the exhaust, the raw water, AC electrical, DC electrical, engine controls, and fuel. So it's just easier for me to get all of that with everything removed. And I'm also going through, obviously, and checking everything out. And one of the things that I decided to do while I was at it, and I'm a big proponent of while I'm at it, is I'm going to pull off the hose here, which is the circulating hose between the circulating pump and the one that comes in the bottom of the expansion tank. This hose has been on the engine since it was installed in 2015, and it still is supple. It doesn't need to be replaced, but I've been carrying a spare on the boat for several years, and it seems ridiculous since I have everything apart. Why not replace it now and keep that other one as a spare? So that's what I'm going to do before I start the process of putting the heat exchanger on. So I'll be back in a second. So I've cleaned the studs. I've chased all the holes with a bolt to make sure that they thread in very easily. I have cleaned the gasket surface with some Scotch-Brite, and I used a shop vac to vacuum out all of the exhaust ports to make sure that if anything did fall in there, that I've sucked it out, or gives me a chance to pull out any extra carbon and stuff. So I'm basically ready to reassemble. One of the things that I wanted to make a note about is when I help some people who are novices at doing this kind of work, sometimes they're intimidated about putting it back together and, oh, am I going to make a mistake? And I just wanted to point out that if you have a parts manual, it shows you exactly in a schematic how everything goes back together. And if you ever have a question about how to reassemble it, don't feel stress. Just go to this diagram and spend some time with it and figure it out. So let me give you an example. So one of the things that has to happen with this process is there is a spring and a thermostat that goes between the head and the expansion tank. Let's say you're concerned about, oh, does it go this way? Does it go this way? Does it go this way? You never have to be concerned because you have the information right here in the manual. And it shows that the spring goes next to the engine and the pointy end of the thermostat goes in to the back of the expansion tank. See how that works? So this is how we're going to put it together. I have the gasket. Obviously the studs are already in place. I just slide the gasket on and pull that in against the engine. I'm ready to install this. So I'm going to take the thermostat as it's indicated, put it in there along with the spring. I'm going to hold the spring with my finger, and I'm going to slowly feed on the expansion tank. Make sure that everything lines up the way it should. Then I'm going to grab my bolts. And I'm going to start threading those in. There's one. So now I'm just going to tighten these up, and I'll be back in 1 second. So I have the expansion tank on, and I have the nuts and the bolts touching the surface. They're not tightened down at all. And I want to talk a little bit about the tightening sequence and torquing. So you want to tighten from the center of the bolts in a crisscross pattern and work your way out. The reason you want to do that is the gasket that is between the expansion tank and the head, hypothetically, if you were to tighten from the outside in, you could actually bunch up that gasket. But what we want to do is actually we want to start at the inside, smush that gasket, and move any kind of wrinkles or anything outward. And as far as torque is concerned, these are M6 bolts, and you can just simply go online and put in M6 bolt torque specification, and it'll tell you the standard torque for a bolt of this size. And you can do that for any bolt on the engine or in any application. If the manufacturer doesn't give you a specific torque specification to tighten this down, you can use industry standard. So for an M6 bolt that is grade 5 or lower, or grade 5 rather, the specification was 4.6 foot-pounds. So I'm using this tool, and from the point where it makes contact with the head to the end of this is, let's say, around 7.5 inches. And so I want to do probably around 10, let's say 8 pounds of force out at the very end here. I didn't do the math, but you get the idea. And so once you figure out a foot-pound, which is 1 pound 1 foot away from the rotational axis, so I'm shorter, so I have to put more weight on it. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to start. Right now I'm just doing maybe 3 pounds of pressure, and I'm starting at the center, and I'm working my way out, doing the same amount of pressure on each of these studs or bolts. And then once all of those are about 3 foot-pounds, then I go to the next one. Once again, I'm working from the inside out, and I'm doing a cross pattern, and I'm doing these one step at a time, just increasing the same amount of torque. Now I'm going to start on my third round. Now I'm about 6 foot-pounds, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, and then that's about 10, 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 about 10, that's about 10, and that's about 10. So that's on, and we're going to go on to the next step. So I'm in the process of hooking up the hose that runs from the circulating pump to the expansion tank, and I noticed that the hose clamp was a little worse for wear. And this particular type of hose clamp that has the slots actually cut through it is not the most desired kind of hose clamp. What you want to do is replace everything that comes on the engine when you get a chance with ones that are stamped into there. This allows you to put more torque without distorting, and it's just a much higher grade hose clamp. So I'm going to replace this old hose clamp with this new, better version and hook up the hose to the expansion tank from the circulating pump, and I'll be back in a second. Normally, after connecting the expansion tank combination exhaust manifold, you would start to hook up the exhaust and hook up the saltwater side of the coolant. But before I get to that, I have to do a couple other things that were associated with the previous project. One of those things includes putting the alternator back on. So I'm essentially going to start at the front of the engine and work towards the back of the generator, doing stuff as I go, because it's going to be easier to keep everything low and to the front done first, because as I add items, it's going to be more difficult to get to things like the alternator. So I'm just doing this in order of easiest access to hardest access. So I'll be back in a minute. So the alternator is on and the belt is tensioned. The next step, as far as ease of access, is going to be the DC electrical. There is a hot wire that connects to the back of the solenoid on the starter right over here, and then the ground connects to the bell housing right below on the starter. So the thing about these is these actually have to go through the sound enclosure. So my next step is to put the sound enclosure in so I can start feeding these wires through that sound enclosure. So that's the next step. So I have the sound enclosure on, and I told you I was going to do the DC electrical, but I realized that the lowest hole on the enclosure, sound enclosure, is the raw water. So I'm going to do that first. So there's the raw water pump, and here is the hose that I just connected up, and then it just runs around the back here and then out the back side of the generator. As I told you, the next step is I'm going to hook up the positive to the back of the starter along with the rest of the wiring harness, and then the negative hooks up to the back of the starter at the bell housing here. So it's just these two bolts, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So here it is completed. You have the negative and the positive connected along with the wiring harness. So on to the next step. So the next step, you can see that I have the raw water hose here. I have the the DC electrical. But over here I have the controls for the generator. And so I'm just going to connect these up, and these just slide in like a... There we go. That's together. Now the next thing is the AC electrical and then the exhaust. So the next step is to do the electrical, and I'm actually going to fix a little bit of an error I had when I first installed this in 2015. When I installed it in 2015, I used 8-gauge wire and came into the enclosure through this hole here and onto this block. Now, at that time in 2015, I consulted the ABYC requirements for electrical wiring, and I misinterpreted at that time one of the meanings of the regulations, or guidelines rather. So 8-gauge wire in an engine space has an amp carrying capacity for each of the conductors of 47.6 amps. This particular generator can only produce 25 amps per conductor. So I almost have a factor of 2 safety. The ABYC guidelines say that if you have a current limited device, meaning a device that can only produce a certain amount of current, that there is an exception to the circuit protection rules where you do not need to have circuit protection, because the thinking is that if I have a generator that is current limited to 25 amps and I have a 47 amp conductor, there's no way that I can have overcurrent that will hurt this wire. Since 2015, when I put this generator in, I have become an ABYC certified electrical technician, and one of the things that I learned during that process is that regardless of the conductor, And even though that in reality this is a current limited device, unless there's a placard on this generator saying that it is a current limited device, I do need to put in circuit protection. So what I am doing is I am adding in circuit protection. So I'm going to have a short run of 8-gauge wire that's going to come from the electrical box. It's going to come out, and then I'm going to mount right here this circuit breaker, and then the wiring from or to the electrical panel where my other circuit breakers are for the house will go from this box into the house. So that's my next step, and I will show you what it looks like when I'm completed. So the wiring is pretty straightforward in the box here. The junction box has U1, U2, V1, V2 labeled, and in the manual it just gives you instructions and line 1, ground, neutral, and line 2. So I have everything lined up. The only other thing that I need to do is I need to connect the ground to ground the actual box. And then in addition to that, I have this jumper that comes with the generator if you want to use it. And that allows you to have your neutral to ground connection inside the generator. I specifically choose that with my system because of the way I have my neutral to ground set up. That may be different with your particular generator. And now I'm going to take this cable and I'll cut it off for a distance where I can put this box right here. I figured I'd just take a minute for some little tips and tricks here. So I'm wiring up this circuit breaker. I'm keeping this cable as short as I can. This is actually the bottoms. It'll flip up and be mounted the opposite way to the inside of the enclosure. So I've got a waterproof here. I've got a zip tie that's holding the cables in. I'm going to route these around into the top. And part of what I've done is I've made this the right size to go into this connector. I have it stripped, but I'm going to add a ferrule. And what a ferrule does is it makes sure that all these little teeny fine wires, nothing can touch something else. So you can see I can slide that on, and it insulates around the edge so none of those wires can get out. And then this is a really soft metal that can be crimped. So now I'm going to feed this in here, and then I can clamp this down, and you can see that it's got a nice insulation. So I'm going to do that to the 3 current carrying wires, and then the ground will be directly coupled to the ground that comes in from the feed. Okay, so here's what the final piece is going to look like. I have to leave the front piece off right now because I have to be able to screw this in. But you can see the 3 ferrules on each side. I have my ground wire connected directly through, but everything else is on a breaker. And so this will just go on there. 4 screws in there. There's a gasket in here that makes this waterproof. So that's complete until I can screw it in. So the next step is feeding the exhaust hose through the sound enclosure. I do have a grommet that I'm going to put in there once everything's aligned. But once I go up to the engine, you can see I've got the hose here, I've got the hose clamp. So I am just feeding that onto the exhaust. I'll get that on all the way, move the hose clamp up, clamp it off, and that'll be on. So I've completed putting on the exhaust hose, have the exhaust clamp on. In addition, I've just put on the over temperature sensor for the exhaust elbow. So the next step is putting on the rest of the cooling system. Okay, so it's time to put the cooling system together. Remember our heat exchanger? I'm going to feed this in to the expansion tank. And then this boot goes on that end, this boot goes on that end. So that's going to work on right now. So I have the boots back on. One of the things that's important about this is you have to squeeze each end and put the clamps that are on the heat exchanger on first and tighten those down, and then on the expansion tank. That way you seal this, you hold everything in, and you compress around the heat exchanger. So next is the air box, but I'm going to remove the tape that covers the intake manifold and the tape that covers the cooling area for the electric end. And I'll be back in a second. You can see the air box is back on. In addition to that, I have a diaper here next to the bleed valve on the fuel filter. The reason I'm doing that is I'm going to bleed the air out of the system. If you remember, I took the fuel lines off to lift the engine, and therefore I've introduced air into the system. So now what I'm going to do is bleed this out. Because this engine is so much higher than the fuel tanks, I have an electric fuel pump that helps feed the generator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call to Tracy, have her turn on the fuel pump, and this is going to bleed out some bubbles, and then I'll use a wrench to tighten it back up. Okay, turn it on.
Do I stay here then?
Yes, because I'll have you turn it off shortly. Okay, that's good. I don't know if you saw that, but there was a bunch of air that spit it out, and that leads me to believe that once the fuel started running clear without any bubbles, that I have all the air out of the system, and we won't know that for sure until we try and start the generator, which won't be too long from now, but that's how you bleed at least up to the fuel filter. Yesterday when I was getting ready to shoot the video of me finishing up the generator and starting it for the very first time, the battery on my phone died. So I'm here the next day. I'm in the salon. You can see the generator right there, and it's running. The vibration is better. It's more different than significantly better. I'm a little disappointed just because I had delusions of grandeur that this was going to be such an amazing difference, but it didn't end up being that way. I'm happy with it. It'll be interesting to see how it does over the long haul. I'm happy I did it because, of course, the engine isolation mounts were worn out and needed to be replaced. But like I said, I was looking for something significantly different. But I'm happy that everything's done and it's up and running and all the maintenance is done. So this ends this video. Once again, I appreciate you subscribing, commenting, and liking this video. I appreciate you looking in. Until next time.